Good morning. I hope my voice is audible to everybody. Good morning, everyone, and very, very welcome to the Love, Sex, and Data Conference. We are extremely excited that after all these months of planning, we are now here on the first day of our conference. And thank you very, very much for joining us at this starting event. Before I proceed into the program, let me make sure that everybody is able to join and engage with the conference with ease. The conference sessions are mostly in English, and we have provided Hindi and sign language interpretation throughout the conference. This is why you might see us reminding our speakers to speak a bit slowly and ensure that all discussions are accessible to everybody. We also have translations in other regional languages. Day one is entirely available in Bengali, and so that translation is available for today. The ISL translation is in the Zoom window on the screen and will say on the screen for all public sessions. On your screen, you should be able to see the entire proceedings translated in the ISL. If you prefer to listen to the conversation either Hindi or Bangla, then click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language and mute the original audio. अंग्रेजी के अलावा इस सत्र का अनुवाद हिंदी, बांग्ला दोनों में आपको अवेलेबल है और अपनी स्क्रीन पर आप यहाँ पर ISL ट्रांसलेशन जो है वो देख पाएंगे। अगर आप हिंदी या बांग्ला में सुनना चाहते हैं तो अपनी स्क्रीन के नीचे एक जो ग्लोब आपको शायद नजर आ रहा होगा उस पर क्लिक करें और अपनी पसंद की भाषा आप चुन लें और ओरिजिनल ऑडियो को म्यूट कर दें। तो आप इस कॉन्फ्रेंस को अलग-अलग भाषाओं में भी एक्सेस कर पाएंगे। Just giving 1 minute for those who want to switch to language translation to do so. Great. So once again, my name is Manak and I work with the YP Foundation. The YP Foundation works with young people to provide skills, perspectives, and opportunities that enable them to take charge of critical decisions in their homes, families, communities, and in policy making, and be recognized as leaders. Since our inception in 2002, we have grown and learned with feminist and rights movements in India and actively straddle these two worlds of development and activism. We build youth leadership that is feminist, rights-based, and intersectional. And we want to ensure that voices in leadership are as diverse as the communities of young people themselves. YP was started by a group of young people who were disappointed by the lack of reflective engagement with social reality and the space to grow in thinking and learning in formal education. We were started to fill that gap. We realized early on that issues of sex, sexuality, relationships, self, and identity are the most difficult to bring out of silences. And since 2005, we have worked on sex ed in some way or the other to mainstream these conversations with young people. With all these years of many feminist groups and organizations pushing this agenda that we have learned from and contributed to, I feel that we've been successful in making pleasure political, but we still have to make politics pleasurable. So when our awesome partners, Paramita and the team at Agents of Ishq proposed the idea of this conference, we were hugely excited to join in the fun. Not just because all these ideas and perspectives resonated and connected with our work, but also because here was an opportunity to engage with them in a joyful, open, and reflective way. That is what we hope to do with this conference and at this conference. All of us, especially in our youth, learn and grow through diverse kinds of experiences. That chat with a friend, that talk you heard at school, the conversation you overheard at home, the performances that you experienced with your friends group, and the ideas that struck you while cooking. All of these contribute to how we think and how we learn. And we hope to replicate the diversity of these freewheeling learning experiences at this conference. So we have presented to you panels, talks, performances, question and answer sessions, freewheeling after hours chats, and many sessions that will make us argue, debate, laugh, learn, and unlearn together. This conference is as much for the world as it is for ourselves. And it has come at a critical moment in politics and interventions where performing your correctness seems to be a little bit more important than actual deep listening. So we have brought together this large and diverse group of people at this conference so we can listen deeply. This is our way to keep questioning and push ourselves to grow intellectually, emotionally, and in our work. So as we start, and I hand over to Paramita to make that push a little bit more urgent and strong, I also want to thank our partners at Agents of Ishq, all our donors, all those who generously gave time to engage with this conference and will be participating in it, and the teams that have worked so hard to put it up together to help us stay true to our DNA and to keep this growing process going. With that, handing over to Paramita, who's our partner in this pleasurable experience.
Thank you, Manak. And hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. Agents of Ishq is a project many of you know and also I think love, but few can precisely describe, including us who work there. We celebrate our indefinability, for we believe that this is what enables us to sit at the intersection of art, entertainment, politics, education, and life. In other words, in the highly intersectional world of pleasure, and to constantly change and transform hand in hand with our audience. What do we mean when we say pleasure? The beauty and poetry and politics and pleasure of that question is that there is no one answer to it. That is what makes pleasure such an inclusive frame, which allows many different worlds and perspectives to enter on their own terms equally. We think of pleasure as something that dispels hierarchies of expertise, of caste, of gender, and imperatives of predefined goals and targets and destinations, while taking into account the whole human being, our social identities, our emotions, our desires, and our intellects, the intersectional self who reflects the intersectional world. It breaks the binaries of tradition and modernity, straight and gay, seriousness and fun, love and sex, good and bad. The politics of pleasure looks not only to the pain of the past or the difficulties of the present, but also the desires and wishes for the future, an imagination of the world we want. Pleasure is expansive, encompassing the personhood of all people and the conditions they need to experience pleasure, politically, socially, culturally, emotionally, and sexually. Pleasure changes the world because it is an ever-expanding, unlimited idea, just like freedom. So standing inside this field of pleasure, we are asking, why is there so little data about pleasure? We ask this question not from the simplistic or marketable perspective of, hey, let's talk about pleasure, but as a deeply political one. The absence of data on pleasure reveals the taboos, hesitations, and discomforts about the inner world of people and communities. It also leads us to wonder, is data on pleasure not gathered because our definitions of data and research are limited to tangibles alone? And if data presents a certain partial picture of reality on which we base our understanding, our interventions, and our policies, then is this kind of partial picture of humanity sufficient to include the diversity of experiences, needs, desires, insights, and realities of different communities? So pleasure poses that question of what counts as data and whose data counts as data. Do we need to think much more expansively about data as well as something that extends from our bodies, our senses and experiences into the world, and not simply as disembodied information for anyone to gather at will and make meaning of without including those bodies that generated that data? The world of productivity, whether donor-led or corporate controlled, and the world of reproductivity, so wedded to heteronormativity, are uneasy with pleasure, maybe because it's hard to control. It's the opposite of control. The conference, we hope, will help us come together and get over this fear and enter the deep and voluptuous pleasure of thinking together, of learning from each other, and growing to overcome that hesitation about pleasure to reshape what we do. We will hear from scholars, from artists, from activists, teachers, sex educators, from people of all ages and backgrounds, what they feel, thinks about data, how the world of our senses and the social world are intertwined, as are our bodies and societies with nature, and as the physical world with the digital world today. Before we continue into the conference, I'm going to take a quick minute to thank some of our colleagues, because you can't see all of them as you might in the physical world. So we will be thanking them throughout the conference because there's too many people we've worked with together. But at present, the core team, the absolutely brilliant and generous and capacious Nisha Susan, who was the head of research and worked with us to curate the conference. And of course, our core team at Agents of Ishq, Debasmita, Shikha, Anshuman, Edgar, Niranjana, and Nandini, and also the team at YP, Vinita, and many others whom you'll see through the conference, emceeing the conference. We will thank our production team later at the end, but we still want to give a shout out to Toral Shah, who has been amazing in keeping us on the straight and narrow, and yet making all our excessively ambitious ideas kind of come true. So without further ado, I will stop talking and say let's have some serious fun together, and hand over to Manak to introduce Charu Gupta.
Thank you. I'm really excited, cannot wait to introduce Charu Gupta, who will be our opening speaker for the conference. I think knowing the history of engagement with pleasure and politics is integral to taking a deeper dive into these ideas in our work and our lives. And I would implore everybody as we listen to Charu speak to really deeply connect this to how we think in our own lives and function. And this is why this talk is important at the start of this conference, to help us connect with everything that comes after a little better and with a little more mindfulness. So Dr. Charu Gupta is a professor in the Department of History, University of Delhi. She is the author of Sexuality, Obscenity, Community, Women, Muslims, and the Hindu Public in Colonial India, and The Gender of Caste, Representing Dalits in Print. She has published several papers in national, international journals on themes of sexualities, masculinities, caste, and religious identities. And I'm really thankful that she has been so generous with her time to help us start off this journey. So over to Charu for starting off on the ideas that the Love, Sex, and Data Conference will bring.
Well, very warm thanks, Manak, and also really a pleasurable thanks to Agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation for inviting me to be a part of this absolutely delightful conference on love, sex, and data. So as a feminist historian of modern India, I'm going to reflect today on histories of pleasure and displeasure in colonial India through some references from popular Hindi print and pulp literature. As Puromita, very eloquently stated, pleasure is really differently constituted in various historical periods, geographical sites, religious texts, print and visual cultures. And it encompasses elite and popular subjects and objects, women, men, erotic art and architecture, food and fantasy, caste and class, sex and love. And while pleasure and prohibition mutually constitute each other, what is really significant about pleasure is that it prolifically lends itself to subversion and transgression, playing with regulatory discourses of religion on the one hand and science on the other. So pleasure spreads out widely and unevenly. It escapes systematization. An Indian history of pleasure also, really makes us reflect on the anecdotal, the mundane, and the everyday, really expanding our archival data. And I need to stress this point because the archival data usually records the painful, the tragic, and the cataclysmic. But for narratives of pleasure, the quotidian becomes imperative, as it is in narrations of everyday life, really that pleasure is ubiquitous. The data on pleasure and its archival traces come from other places, from other sources. So our ancient Hindu and medieval Islamic texts reveal rich histories of love and pleasure, from Kama Sutra and Kumar Sambhav to the enchanting world of Urdu poetry, from sculptures of anal texts to anal sex to threesomes and orgies on the walls of temples, and an extolling of pleasures of non-reproductive sex. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you, and I request that the first slide be shared with all of you. So history of pleasure also makes us reflect that while women are, of course, victims of violent crimes, the persistent foregrounding of pain and political correctness often marginalizes women's pleasures. So, in our histories and experiences of ishq and pleasure, what are the shifts and displacements that occurred with the coming of colonialism and modernity? Why were there increasing moral panics and censorships? And of course, we know that taboos on love and pleasure have been carried out over and above by the state, but there are also explicit and implicit censorships by the moralist brigade of dominant castes, majority religious communities, and patriarchies. Now, Foucauldian frameworks underline how propagation of disciplinary regimes, a rise of literacy, and spread of print actually led to an intensification in the management and policing of sexuality, love, and pleasure in the modern period. Riding on the wave of an overwhelming ideal of puritanical Victorian morality and chastity, the everyday pleasures and enjoyments of the colonized, Festival of Holi, singing of marriage songs, courtesans, fairs, watching Nautanki, poetic descriptions of the female body, and erotic representations of non-normative sexualities came to be increasingly depicted, by the Britishers and a section of Indian elites and aspiring Hindu middle classes as breeding grounds for a spectrum of imagined vices and the loci of decadence, which were used in the rhetoric of an evangelical civilizing mission on the one hand and the serious business of nationalism on the other. So what we see is with modernity and colonialism, the disciplining of pleasure got much more institutionalized. So let me begin from an example from Hindi literature. And as I said, most of my examples are going to come from Hindi popular pulp kind of literature and from canonized literary frames. So this was a time when, efforts were being made at linguistic standardization of Hindi, combined with, attacks on any hints of eroticism and obscenity in literature, which were seen as hallmarks of a decadent, feminine, and uncivilized culture. Next slide, please. So there was a growing fear of romance, of sexual and bodily pleasure, which was seen as a transgression of the ideals of the nation. So sex came to be explicitly linked with procreation and not pleasure. In some ways, aesthetics became an exercise in ethics. So an influential section of Hindi writers pervasively attacked the sensual Shringar Ras and Ritikal poetry and erotic descriptions of women. So, for example, as this quote on your screen shows, the famous, Mahavi Prasad Dwivedi critiqued the Ritikal poetry for its supposed dirty and sinful portrayal of women lovers. Next slide, please. Or the famous poet, Sumitra Nandan Pant, trenchantly attacked the sensual and alleged gaudy descriptions of women, juxtaposing it to the devoted and chaste Hindu wife. And in this process, the joyous figure of Radha, who is neither a mother nor a wife, she's a parakya, she's a lover, that almost completely disappeared from the canons of Hindi literary syllabi and normative poetry, and the image of woman became a stiflingly moral one. And yet, going beyond Foucauldian paradigms, modernity brought its own material sexual pleasures and popular mass entertainment. For example, as shows my dear friend Anjali Arundikar, a 19th century sex manual meant largely for women noted that the new India rubber dildo was much better than early dildos made of ivory and silver, as it provided women with an uncannily real pleasure. So a history of dildo shows how its modern avatars exceeded normative visual registers, as its resemblance to a penis lied not in that it looked like a prick, but in that it felt like one and fitted into the texture of a porn narrative of female seat of pleasure. Next slide. Moreover, print facilitated the widespread production and distribution of cheaply produced and priced so-called dirty and ashleel books and advertisements of aphrodisiacs as a commodity. Erotic consumerism became a part of publishing boom, providing new mass entertainment and at times disturbing the dominant heterosexual and procreative imperative. Creating a robust archive and data, the theater of the local and the vernacular became central to texts of sex, love, and pleasure. Next. So while social reformers treated romantic love as an irrelevant joke, depictions of romantic love in modern print public culture, even while often within heteronormative paradigms, profoundly altered intimate concerns and brought new intensity in conjugal relationships. Sex manuals in Hindi and pamphlets of songs and satires in Braj saw substantial growth, actually outnumbering educational and boring reformist literature. Combining erotica, classics, and science, at least 30 books were published in Hindi in early 20th century that contained words like Kam Shastra, Kok Shastra, Riti Shastra, Rati Kriya. And while a substantial part of these texts were against masturbation or multiple sex partners and homosexuality, they made sex knowable to a Hindi reading public at a relatively cheap price. Weaving together sexual ethics, knowledge, and politics, they embraced a range of standpoints which at times colluded and at others defied the imperium of normative pleasures. The vernacular opened a plural and heterogeneous world of epistemic possibilities of pleasure, incorporating Sanskrit and Persian, but also going beyond them. In spite of wavering patronage and censorship, such publications thrived and were sustained by market forces. The print and the visual created spatial intimate spaces which opened ancillary textures that precluded the crafting of any master narrative. Deeply embarrassing for the prudish and conservative elites, such vernacular spaces could also offer dissent against the flawed normativities of the time. The vernacular also led to a democratization of pleasure as the phobic and the erotic functioned in tandem. Now, feminists have also questioned divisions often made between legitimate erotic art and obscene pornography, and the witticism goes, what I like is erotica and what you like is porn. Distinctions also need to be made between sexually explicit representations and sexism. Consensual and coercive sex cannot be collapsed. Porn sells widely, and there is also a highly diversified market for local porn in regional languages. The overwhelming argument thus made about the triumph of sexual conservatism and a grim morality in modern India needs to be qualified to some extent. Since I'm a historian of modern India, let me take another example of representations of homosexuality. Now, dominant narratives of love uphold monogamous, heterosexual, same-sex community caste relationships. In the colonial period, same-sex attractions represented a dangerous breach to nationalist ideals and Hindu community assertions, resulting, of course, in Section 377, but there were other manifestations. Next slide, please. Amidst this, the publication of Pandey Bechain Sharma Ugr's book, Chocolate, which was published in 1927, or Chocolate, as it was called in Hindi, which dealt with sodomy, sexual acts between adult males and adolescent boys, and homosexuality. Now, Chocolate was a collection of 8 stories, which were variously titled Hey Sukumar, Vyabhichari Pyar, Jail Mein, Hum Fidaye Lucknow, Kamariya Nagan Sibal Khai. And it was written in a titillating style, and these stories were supposedly against homosexuality. However, they also acknowledged its wide prevalence. Chocolate hinted at homosexual tendencies between Krishna and Arjun, Ram and Tulsidas, Krishna and Surdas. It also showed that gardens, jails, colleges, and libraries were the new modern sites of homosexual pleasure, absorbing elements of public parade and private desire, hurried encounter, and lengthy leisure. Chocolate proved to be a commercial sensation, and within 6 weeks, 2 editions were sold out. However, it was soon banned, and the guardians of morality launched militant criticism against it and threw it against many writings like Ugr's Dilli Ka Dalal, and also books like Vyabhichari Mandir and Ablao Ka Insaf, calling them ghasleti sahitya, or literature that is worth the trash. A movement against it known as ghasleti andolan was sustained for 12 years, and it was backed by the new Hindi loci of authority, university departments, library associations, and important journals. Provoking a hysterical reaction, the campaign against chocolate was at once paternalistic and moralist to so-called protect the public from unhealthy influences. Ugru wrote on a taboo subject and spoke the unspeakable, with critics claiming that its actual effect was to encourage homosexual desire. Chocolate threw into doubt the stability of the heterosexual regime and modern monogamous ideals. Let me move to the pleasures of the relationship between Devar Bhabhi. Idealized as a maternal figure of, to the Devar, the Bhabhi has been the object and subject of erotic pleasure. Bhabhi means the elder sister-in-law, Devar means the younger brother-in-law. Now, literature, films, and folk songs in India are replete with references to the desired and desiring sister-in-law and pleasures of illicit liaisons between Devar Bhabhi. Next. In the colonial period, increasing migration, growing loneliness, urbanization, and education may have further led to a section of women to seek in such extramarital relationships a degree of solace and escape from everyday drudgery. Such undercurrents led to exaggerated fears among Hindu reformers in colonial India, who insisted on their prohibition, which was reflected in these series of cartoons published in the celebrated magazine Chand. Next. So these cartoons launched a moral crusade against current misdeeds of Devar Bhabhi. So on the one hand was depicted this ideal relationship of the past between Lakshman and Sita, and on the other, great worry was expressed about the present state of affairs. Next. In the past, it was stated Lakshman never met Sita's eyes, protected her fiercely, and was not able to even recognize her earrings when she was kidnapped. In the present, it was alleged Devars were showing Bhabhi's dirty pictures, combing their hair, and romancing them. Next, the theme of Devar Bhabhi's attraction finds powerful expression in Satyajit Ray's widely acclaimed Charu Gupta, which was released in 1964, which was based on a story by Rabindranath Tagore, and which has undercurrents of Rabindranath Tagore's own relationship with his sister-in-law. Next, or Suraj Barjatia's blockbuster Hum Aapke Hain Kaun also places the figure of the Bhabhi within this tension. Next, and of course, the much loved and banned Savita Bhabhi website symbolizes discourses of pleasure and the politics of porn. The Indian government blocked the cartoon strips and website in 2009 about the sexual adventures of the hot Indian Bhabhi, who was described as a regular Indian woman who just can't get enough sex. And this was banned under Section 67 of IT Act, which prohibits the publication and transmission of any material which is lascivious or appeals to the prurient interest, or which affects, could corrupt and deprave, and which is deemed threatening to the sovereignty or integrity of India, defense and security of the state. Imagine Savita Bhabhi being a threat to the security of the state. So this demise of India's best loved bhabhi was mourned by thousands of online admirers. There were headlines like assassination of Savita Bhabhi and death of India's first porn star. And detractors alleged that the site denigrated Indian women, insulted Indian family values, it threatened Indian culture. Savita Bhabhi, but actually, I think she embodies for the moral purists the most terrifying idea about pleasurable transactions. She's married, but she's not monogamous. She has sex for fun and not for procreation or love. And in choosing lovers, she does not discriminate on grounds of class, caste, gender, occupation, age, or status. So the tension between what can be seen and what should not be seen constitute much of the lure and seduction of the banned series. And so many people have written on this, Sanjay Srivastav, Shohini Ghosh, and many others, So I think, and I'm drawing from their work, to talk about Savita Bhabhi. So let me move to another snapshot. We know that love and pleasure also have a caste, class, and religion. So the next slide, please. So can we move to the next slide, please? So in late colonial India, Brahmanical patriarchies and Hindu identities sought to censure any hint of intimacy, romance, and illicit pleasures of upper caste Hindu women, particularly vis-a-vis the perceived others, be it the Muslim male, the Dalit woman, the widow, the prostitute, or the servant. So on your screen, you see this quote from one of the Hindi didactic manuals, which is actually meant for upper caste, middle class Hindu women, telling them to be aware, to cautioning them against these Dalit women or these women servants who enter their households and to be away from them. Next. Moreover, roti beti taboos have been central to caste practices of spatial and bodily exclusions. Endogamy is a cornerstone of caste, where through arrangements of marriages, relations and boundaries are policed. Next. So Ambedkar and Santram B.A., who was the founder of Jat Pat Torak Mandal, they argued that intercaste marriage was the most important solution to annihilating caste, since it challenged the relationship between maintenance of caste purity and control of women's sexuality. Next. In the highly adverse female-male ratio of Punjab, Haryana, Jats often married women from lower caste groups through the customary practice of kareva or chadarandazi. However, pressure on land and upward mobility led to serious challenges to such intercaste relationships from the colonial period, and Prem Chaudhary has done some excellent work on this. So the British Penal Code 1860 introduced notions of modesty and chastity, abduction and incitement as part of a framework of collective honor. Next. Increasing fears also came to be expressed about illicit collusions and pleasures between upper caste mistresses and male servants. Next, even more forbidden were interreligious intimacies, as serious attempts were made to keep Hindu men away from Muslim men and from symbols and customs perceived as Muslim. These reached a peak in the 1920s in North India due to increasing sectarian and communal tensions. The day-to-day living of women, people with whom they interacted and brought their things, their forms of entertainment, cultural life, and religious feelings came under the scrutiny of Hindu ideologues. And what you see on your screen are these detailed instructions, given to Hindu women. Next, campaigns were carried against Muslim bangle sellers or manihars, asking Hindu women to stay away from them. And of course, this involves a whole idea of touch, purity, pollution, etc. Next, instructions to Hindu women were specifically aimed at their supposedly frenzied relationship with peers. And these kind of cartoons were published in the 1920s. Next, Even widow remarriage was linked to alleged decline of Hindu population, anxieties about elopements and conversions of Hindu widows by Muslims, with suggestions that the reproductive capacities of widows actually can enhance Hindu numbers. So anxieties of who is bedding and wedding women have been embedded in a distinct Hindu nationalism. Romance and elopement thus came to be increasingly rewritten as abduction. Next, in many ways, there are uncanny resonances of such articulations in the mythical love jihad campaign in contemporary India. Next, two images pervasive in the vernacular vocabulary of early 20th century was the lustful and sexually predatory Muslim male on the one hand, and the victimized, vulnerable, and foolish Hindu woman on the other, which have had a long afterlife. Next, denied the language of love, the specter of illegibility has been marked as Muslim. Next, Hindu women have been told in convoluted ways that interfaith romance is not only undesirable, but stopping it is good for women themselves. Next, and that the mere act of marrying a Muslim ensures dreadful fate for Hindu women. However, even amid such censorships, a language of romance that cuts across religious and caste boundaries has been used by some women to defy community homogeneity. In fact, the vernacular archive of conversions can also be read as an archive of desire and pleasure. For example, conversions could become a way for women to negotiate codified relations, which aided the transformative politics of religious and sartorial rights. For example, conversions to Christianity, while signaling discourses of respectability and missions of domesticity, also opened some opportunities for Dalit women of education and training in colonial India. Many of them refused to do unpaid midwives' work and begar, or unpaid labor. Next. So conversion to Christianity also had implications for Dalit women's clothing, as it brought to the fore questions of the body vis-a-vis caste. Traditionally, Dalit women had to endure humiliating dress restrictions, which were also ways to mark their bodies as inferior and promiscuous. Conversion to Christianity marked a transformed disposition of caste-marked bodies. Next, clothing became an indicator to distinguish Dalit Christian women from their unconverted counterparts. Next, in the early 20th century, cartoons depicting the crisis of conversions entered the Hindi print public sphere, putting on display the sexual unease of reformist Hindus. Next, so even while lamenting Dalit women's conversions, reformers could not help but acknowledge the change of demeanor it brought about in Dalits in modes of dressing, walking style, gait, and prestige, with Dalit women enjoying pleasures of umbrellas, purses, hats, skirts, and high-heeled shoes. So such cartoons inadvertently offer a counter-politics of sartorial pleasures. The recalcitrance of love and pleasure and the interface between norms and everyday practices throws up emancipatory possibilities of intimate rights, where highly ritualized acts of conversion, clothing, and marriage could at times become a metaphor for a new vocabulary of selfhood, body, and dignity. Next, in contemporary times, examples of censorships abound. For example, attacks on songs like Choli Ke Piche Kya Hai. Next, campaigns against M.F. Hussein's painting Saraswati in the nude. Next, withdrawal of Delhi Tourism Diary due to protest by BJP against depictions of the nude Yakshini or dancing girl from Mohenjo-daro, virulent attacks on Valentine's Day, and policing of women's clothes and entertainment. Next, and yet women have come out against all kinds of censorships, and as the queer politics, gays, and many others. The Pinjara Tod movement in various universities is a protest against sexist rules and unnecessary restrictions against state authorities acting like khap panchayats. Next, in spite of massive attack by the Hindu right against Valentine's Day on young women and men, it has acquired desi flavors, as it was very visible in the Agents of Ishq website as well. Next slide, please. So the pink chaddi campaign was a non-violent gesture of ridicule and protest. And the word chaddi, I think, is very significant here, as the word panty denotes a woman's underwear. Chaddi desexualizes it, while also playing on the pejorative slang for RSS uniform of khaki shorts. Next, similarly, the Kiss to Love campaign with its Sanghi Gunde Hoshyar, Tere Samne Karenge Pyar, and Pyar Kiya To Darna Kya turned moral policing upside down. Next. So the discrete snapshots here show that censorship is a failed enterprise and that identities are muddy and fluid. A politics that imposes prescriptions and designates what is appropriate and legitimate is constantly being subverted in everyday lives and actions. Even amidst new regulations, examples abound of freedom, sharing, love, and pleasure. The messy and inchoate ways of life, our heterogeneities and pluralities, suggest a different order of rationality against efforts to censure, categorize, and classify. The Savita Bhavi comic strip, our dildos, cinema and theater, our dirty literature, sessions of gossip and laughter, the delights of Lahori kebabs and golgappas on the street, and the hidden archives of desire continue to enrich our everyday histories of pleasure. The terrain of ishq and pleasure is messy, disorderly, and capacious, and in many ways implicitly opposite to a singular monolithic imagery of India. Thank you. I'll end there. Puromita, you need to unmute yourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Charu, that we couldn't have hoped for a more simultaneously exciting and comforting beginning to the conference, because of what you said, that so-called impossible ishqs are actually possible and are thriving. And I have a favorite line from a Hindi film song, Badli teri nazar to nazare badal gaye. If you just change how you're looking or even at what you are looking, then you will see the world quite differently, which I think is something you have done for us. Now, we already have some questions, but I'm, of course, going to do what moderators do and first ask a question that I wanted to ask as I listened to you. I was just thinking that the connections between what has been happening for the last 200 years, the feeling that we always have that we are the first to confront something is always undone when you look back at histories of pleasure and contemporary life, as opposed to this kind of linearity of tradition and modernity as a straight upward path, right? In what ways, I mean, in some ways, the right-wing censorship and resistance to these things, or orthodox resistance to these things, is easy to pinpoint. But I was also thinking about the way progressive or self-appointed progressive cultures become censorious, right? Like, how do we accommodate critiques of our Hindi film songs all about stalking? What about the meaning of women in popular culture and so on? These discourses have always existed, and I wondered what you thought about that.
Okay, so you want me to answer each question, or you want me to take all? Okay, okay. So absolutely. I mean, there is a huge streak of puritanism that you see in so many of the progressive kind of articulations, and there is this kind, the fear of the unsaid, the fear of all the underlying kind of tensions and excitements of romance, seems to be covering the right and the left in many ways. And you see this kind of language of puritanism, of control. I mean, even some of the revolutionaries were, these supporters of brahmacharya and, celibacy, because they thought that we have to preserve our semen for the service of the nation. And there was this kind of juxtaposition and opposition between pleasure and, freedom and nationalism, which, and of course, Gandhi is a classic example, but even Bhagat Singh, for that matter. So I think that is important to recognize. And what was the second part you said? Sorry, Paramita, missed it.
I mean, this idea of critiquing the depiction of women
Yes.
within Hindi film songs or popular culture.
So I think, I mean, I know there is a huge debate regarding censorships, for example. So I'm not at all for banning anything, whether it is a song stalking a woman or something. I think the only reply to that is are quote unquote good songs, which which celebrate consensual romance, which celebrate romance and love, which breaks all boundaries. And I think this kind of, what we see about popular culture is either there is this kind of huge celebration, or there is this complete disparaging and critique and, just downgrading it and critiquing it. I think, it depends upon the context, about the uses that we put to it, about the eyes that we deploy to see it. A rape scene can be titillating for somebody, and it can be disgusting for somebody and arouse in one, emotions of extreme protest and anger as well. So I think that it is, the visuality is the way you see it, it's heterogeneous. There is multiple gazes to a picture, to a frame, to a popular kind of song. So I think we need more of, pleasures that celebrate, consensual sex of all kinds, romances of all kinds. I think that's the way to go ahead.
I mean, I think to go back to something Manak said at the beginning, that at this particular moment, we find ourselves polarized and also very hesitant in the face of political correctness and giving offense. And to some extent, your talk actually points us in the direction of a kind of robust resilience that we can get from a kind of education in popular culture, and using popular culture as a domain through which to discuss our thoughts about these things. But there is a question which actually also links to what you said about the independence movement and progressive celibacies. Do you think that Gandhi's experiments in his own ashram around sex and unity have built some kind of legacy in post-independence Indian history?
So I think Gandhi is quite a fascinating figure. I mean, even if you look at, some of the autobiographies, for example, of women and men, there is a lot of self-censorship where they will talk about public spaces, they will talk about their public life. But as far as the intimate sexual lives are concerned, that is never even put forth in an autobiography. Well, Gandhi is much more open, he's different from other kinds of autobiographies that are written. He's ready to talk about his sexual life. So I think what is different, say, about Gandhi is that at least he brings the issue of sex on the table. The problem with Gandhi is, of course, is that he sees women as passive recipients of sexual pleasure, and he sees men as the perpetrators. And of course, he then articulates a whole language of banning of the idea of sexual pleasure. And he thinks that if men can control, he never thinks that women have sexual urges, that women, can be active partners. So that is the problem with Gandhi, that Gandhi is, while he brings sex on the table, then he goes and takes on this kind of whole language of brahmacharya and protection of desires, and again linking it to this larger idea of discourse of the nation and freedom. So of course, I think there is, and Gandhi is a paradoxical figure. You will read some quotes from it and you will think it's a feminist speaking. And on the other hand, you will see it's the most retrogressive patriarch speaking. So he has this kind of a mixed baggage and legacy, which we need to take into account.
I mean, it's very interesting the way that you put forward that if we can't take female pleasure, or multiple pleasures, not just the cis heterosexual male's pleasures into account, we seem to be stuck between the binary of actually violence and abstinence, as if to say there is no other route for us, right? The next question, in the myths too, Draupadi was sexually harassed by Jayadratha, who was only Kaurava's sister's husband. but he was let go as he was a part of the family. I guess that's more a comment than a question. I'm going to read some interesting comments, though I think they're outside the purview of the talk, just because there are a variety of perspectives. Have you looked at alternatives of money as cryptocurrencies to look at new possibilities of non-heteronormativity? I think it's a very provocative and interesting question for maybe for us all to think about, but maybe not in this talk, so I won't ask Charu to respond. I mean, of course, yes, India is where the Kama Sutra was born, and yet discussions of sex and relationships is taboo. After the banning of
I want to respond to that.
So also, what to do about sex education is the follow-up question.
Yeah. So you see, what we see is a shift. So for example, when the British came, or actually, even if one of my friends was visiting from the US, and of course he saw all these men holding hands and hugging. So he says, "Oh God, homosexuality is widely prevalent," because this idea of men holding hands and hugging each other in public was something that Western societies, it's quite there are all kinds of taboos and all kinds of interpretations made out of that. But on the other hand, what we see is that in the earlier period, the image was that the East or the colonized colony, that is the place of sexual perversions, of excessive sensuality, of pervasive, of loose sexual morals, of there was this kind of imagery built about the East, and the West was seen as this chaste, moral, proper woman place, where. And what happens is that we have seen this shift that occurred, and of course, the colonialism, and of course, this whole section of Indian elites and middle classes who wanted to prove that we are also equally civilized and we are equally, progressive and modern. They went about, then saying that no, homosexuality is Western, lesbianism is Western, everything is Western. All these, we are more chaste, we are more pure than the West, and there was this caricaturing of the Western name Sahib, she is loose, there are high divorce rates, etc., etc. So what we see is this shift occurring where, and both remain very problematic positions, where there are these kind of binaries ways that now West is the site of all corruption and all this, and we are the ones, who are trying to uphold this puritanical, pure, this. And of course, Kama Sutra is seen as this, where I think there is some, when it is classical erotica, it is to some extent, quote unquote, acceptable. When it comes to, when the moment it spreads to popular and mass culture, it becomes pornful. So there is this kind of distinction that's made, sometimes Kumar Sambhav and Kalidas's erotic descriptions are, quote unquote, acceptable. But the moment it goes into this, but Savita Bhavi is not, so there is this kind of binary that is often made.
Yeah, in the film Ishq, Babban says this thing, "Tumhara ishq, ishq, hamara ishq, sex." So it's that.
Yes.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to combine two questions because I feel they're kind of related, or I'm going to ask you to address them jointly. It's funny how the clause in the IT Information Act that censored Savita Bhavi is all about state security and perversion, and says nothing about respect, safety, and violation. How would you reimagine this? And can we deduce that the banning of porn and lack of awareness around prostitution or sex work are pertinent reasons behind promoting taboo?
So again, I mean, there is a whole range of viewpoints we know regarding prostitution. Well, I'm all for not just legalizing it, but also for removing any decriminalizing it, as well as legalizing. And this argument that is being made, so that the sex workers, they have certain labor rights, other kinds of rights is absolutely imperative. I mean, there was this very interesting, if you take an example from the colonial period, and again, Anjali has talked about it, there was this idea that sex work is only exclusively for women is also wrong, because while largely, of course, women are engaged with it. I mean, there was this report about male brothels of Karachi that has disappeared from the archives, which Richard Burton carried out. Very interesting report, which was about a whole lot of brothels which were where you had male sex workers or gay sex workers, etc. So those kinds of, and I think the only way in which to treat this is to to decriminalize it and to legalize it. And this whole kind of moral framework that is attached to prostitution, I think we need to seriously question. I'm all against child prostitution, and I think or child pornography. And I do think that we should have some rules. And again, there can be a debate about that. But I'm totally against any kind of censorship or this kind of criminalization or, which goes on, against porn or prostitution.
Thank you, Charu. I think, do we have time for another question, or are we out of time? I guess we're out of time, right? So, okay. So there are all these questions about Korean drama, which I was dying to take on, but we will have to have another conference to talk about the pleasures of Korean drama.
I know.
Indian pleasure.
With the heteronormative frameworks, and I still enjoy them.
Very much. And so, but I think, for us, the talk has been a kind of wonderful opening up of the questions of the archive of pleasure. And the archive of pleasure always shows us the cross-section we stand at, the intersection of the past and the past we've come from, the future we are going towards, and all the different kinds of forces in a society that every human being lives with are all swirling around us. And when we look at the archive of pleasure, I think it shows us many different desires and aspirations that exist amongst people, that people are defining for themselves, not being defined by others for people. And maybe that many notions of respectability live inside this word we use, respect, but which is actually respectability and the desire to be an elite in society. So thank you for all of these really lovely ideas to set us off thinking through the conference. Some of the things that Charu has touched upon will be discussed in the conference in different ways. Sex education, questions that came up about young people will be addressed in panels to the conference. Please do have a look at the schedule. Please tell your friends about it. Please tweet the hell out of the conference with the hashtag love, sex, and data, because you already know how much fun it is to be here and what awesome speakers doing awesome work we've got. For anybody who wanted to know, Charu also referred to the work of Anjali Arondikar and Shohini Ghosh through her talk. Please do look up these writers, because along with Charu's work, their work too forms an archive of thinking about these things differently. And so, with thanks to Charu for doing this talk and starting the conference for us.
Thanks.
I'm going to have
such a pleasure.
Thank you. Please come to some more talks if you can.
Sure.
And I'm now going to hand over to the dapper Manak Matyani, my colleague, to introduce to you a very tingly special section called Pleasure Pockets. And I will see you at the other panels. Thank you.